The auction block in Charleston, South Carolina had witnessed the sale of more than 10,000 human beings by the spring of 1852. But nothing in Thomas McKinley's 23 years as an auctioneer prepared him for the moment when a mixed-race woman in an expensive silk dress stepped forward to bid on a white man. The crowd fell silent. Not the respectful quiet that followed a gentleman's bid, but the stunned, suffocating silence that precedes violence. McKinley's hand froze mid-gesture, the gavel suddenly heavy as lead in his palm. The Irishman on the block, unwashed, shackled, his eyes hollow with despair, looked at the woman and spat a single word that would have gotten him killed had anyone else heard it clearly. But she didn't flinch. She raised her gloved hand higher and announced in a voice that carried across the humid morning air, $200, and I'll pay cash. What followed in the next 5 minutes would be discussed in whispered scandals for decades, buried in courthouse records that officials would later claim were lost to fire, and become the foundation of a story so dangerous to America's mythology that both North and South agreed, for once, that some truths should never be written down. Charleston's reputation as a commercial hub rested on 2 pillars: cotton and human commerce. By 1852, the city's auction houses processed enslaved people with the efficient brutality of factory production. The blocks operated 6 days a week, their calendars published in newspapers alongside ship schedules and commodity prices. Families were separated with the same casual indifference grocers applied to dividing bulk sugar. Children were sold by the pound of future labor they represented. And through it all, the auctioneers maintained a veneer of civility that allowed buyers to pretend they were engaged in legitimate business rather than the systematic destruction of human dignity. Thomas McKinley considered himself a professional. He refused to auction children under 5 separated from their mothers, a moral boundary he defended as good business practice, since such sales generated bad publicity and attracted abolitionist attention. He required buyers to present proof of funds before bidding, maintaining order in a market prone to speculation and fraud. And he insisted on accurate descriptions in his catalogs, listing skills, ages, and physical conditions with the precision of a livestock trader, committed to protecting his reputation. But on the morning of March 14, 1852, McKinley's carefully constructed world encountered something the South's racial hierarchy had not adequately prepared him to process. Money in the hands of a person who existed in the undefined space between slave and free, between white and black, between the categories that Southern society depended upon to function. Her name, according to the bill of sale that would later surface in fragmentary form, was Eliza Clemens, though variations of that name appear across different documents: Elizabeth Clemens, Elisa Clements, Lisa Clemen. The inconsistency itself suggests something deliberately obscured, a figure who moved through legal records like smoke, visible enough to leave traces, but impossible to grasp with certainty. What can be verified is this: she arrived at McKinley's auction house in a private carriage, accompanied by a white attorney named Marcus Bellingham, who presented documents establishing her legal status as a free person of color under South Carolina law. The papers, stamped and notarized, traced her lineage to a white planter named Jonathan Clemens, who had died in 1848, leaving his entire estate, 2,400 acres of tobacco land, a processing facility, and considerable cash reserves, to the daughter he had acknowledged in his will, but never in public life. South Carolina law in 1852 occupied a peculiar position regarding free persons of color. They existed in legal limbo, possessing some property rights, but no political voice, allowed to own businesses, but forbidden to testify against whites in court, capable of accumulating wealth, but subject to arbitrary restrictions on movement and assembly. They numbered perhaps 8,000 in a state of more than 400,000 enslaved people, their presence tolerated as evidence of Southern flexibility while being carefully controlled to prevent any suggestion that racial hierarchy might be negotiable. Jonathan Clemens had been clever or cynical in structuring his will. He didn't free Eliza from slavery because she had never been formally enslaved. Her mother had been a slave, yes, but Clemens had purchased and freed her before Eliza's birth, establishing the child as legally free from the moment she drew breath. Then he had spent the next 30 years teaching his daughter everything a planter's son would learn: accounting, crop rotation, labor management, legal navigation, and the brutal arithmetic of making human misery profitable. When he died, his white relatives contested the will immediately. They argued that no mulatto woman could possibly manage a plantation, that the inheritance should revert to Clemens's legitimate, read white heirs, that allowing such property to pass to a person of color violated the natural order God himself had established. The case consumed 2 years and cost Eliza nearly a third of her inheritance in legal fees. But Marcus Bellingham was skilled, the will was ironclad, and South Carolina's courts ultimately ruled that property rights superseded racial considerations, at least when the property in question belonged to a white man with enough wealth to make his posthumous wishes legally unassailable. By March 1852, Eliza Clemens owned the plantation. But ownership created immediate problems that her father had either not anticipated or had maliciously left for her to solve. The labor force he had used, 84 enslaved black people, had been sold off by the white relatives during the legal battle, ostensibly to protect the estate's assets, but actually to strip Eliza of the means to operate her inherited land. When she finally won her case, she gained title to empty fields and a processing facility with no one to work it. The solution she arrived at was radical, practical, and deeply threatening to every assumption the South built its identity upon. If she couldn't purchase black slaves, either because she lacked the capital after legal fees or because local sellers refused to transact with a woman of color, she would acquire the only labor legally available to someone in her position: white, indentured servants, convict laborers, and Irish immigrants sold into temporary bondage to pay passage debts. The system of white servitude in America had declined significantly since the colonial period, but it hadn't disappeared entirely. Thousands of Irish fled famine conditions in the 1840s, arriving penniless and willing to sign contracts that bound them to years of labor in exchange for passage, food, and shelter. Courts continued sentencing convicts to labor terms that could be purchased by plantation owners willing to pay the state for access to prisoners. And the apparatus of debt peonage trapped poor whites in cycles of borrowing and repayment that effectively sold their labor to whoever held their obligations. Eliza understood that purchasing such people was legal. What made it scandalous was that a woman of color would exercise that legal right, transforming the racial hierarchy into something Charleston's elite found ideologically intolerable: a system where whiteness no longer guaranteed dominance. The Irishman on McKinley's block that March morning was named Sean Farrell. His passage contract from Cork had been sold 3 times already, each owner passing him along when his labor failed to cover his mounting debts. He was 28 years old, literate in English, trained as a stonemason, and currently worth $175 according to McKinley's assessment. The auction listing described him as strong back, stubborn temperament, suitable for outdoor labor under firm supervision. When Eliza bid $200, a premium price that exceeded the usual rate for such contracts, McKinley faced a choice that had no precedent in his professional experience. Legally, he couldn't refuse her bid. Her money was genuine. Her documents established her right to own property, and the sale of indentured contracts to any buyer with funds was standard practice. But accepting her bid meant publicly acknowledging that racial hierarchy was subordinate to capital, that a person of color could hold legal power over a white person, and that the entire mythology of white supremacy might be more fragile than Charleston society wanted to admit. McKinley looked at his assistant, a younger man named Dawkins, who had gone pale. He looked at the crowd, where men shifted uncomfortably, hands drifting toward coat pockets where pistols rested. He looked at Marcus Bellingham, who stood beside Eliza, with the calm expression of someone confident the law would support his client. And then he looked at Eliza herself, whose face showed no triumph, no gloating, only the cool assessment of someone conducting business. "The bid stands at $200, McKinley said finally, his voice tight. "Do I hear 225? Silence. No one would bid against her, not because they lacked funds, but because doing so would legitimize the transaction, would acknowledge that they were competing with a woman of color in an open market for white labor. Better to let the sale proceed, to treat it as an aberration, and then address the problem through other channels afterward. McKinley's gavel came down 3 times. "Sold to Miss Clemens for $200. Sean Farrell's eyes widened with a mixture of disbelief and fury. He opened his mouth to speak, then seemed to realize that protest would accomplish nothing. Eliza stepped forward, counted out 20 $10 gold coins onto the auction block with deliberate precision, and accepted the contract documents McKinley extended, with hands that trembled slightly, despite his effort to maintain professional composure. "I'll collect him tomorrow morning," she said. "Please ensure he's fed and rested. I don't purchase damaged goods." Then she turned and walked back to her carriage, leaving behind a crowd of men who suddenly had to confront the possibility that the rules they had assumed were natural law might actually be nothing more than convenient fictions, enforced only as long as everyone agreed to pretend they were real. News of the purchase reached the Charleston Mercury by evening, though the article that appeared the next day was carefully worded to avoid explicitly stating what had occurred. "A transaction of unusual character took place yesterday at McKinley's establishment," it reported, "wherein a free person of color acquired contract labor for plantation purposes. The development raises questions about the application of existing statutes to novel circumstances." Novel circumstances. The phrase would become a euphemism repeated across dozens of similar articles over the next 13 years as Eliza Clemens continued purchasing white labor, eventually owning contracts for 40 individuals simultaneously, operating her plantation with a workforce that inverted everything Southern ideology claimed was natural, proper, and divinely ordained. But that first purchase, That moment when McKinley's gavel fell and Sean Farrell's contract passed into the hands of a woman whose existence challenged the entire premise of racial slavery, marked something more significant than a business transaction. It marked the beginning of a story that both North and South would later agree must be erased, forgotten, buried so deeply that even historians would struggle to confirm whether it had actually happened at all. Because if one woman could own white men legally, publicly, and profitably, what did that say about the entire edifice of slavery? What did it reveal about which aspects of the system were actually about race, and which were simply about power wielded by whoever had the money and legal standing to exercise it? Those questions were dangerous. By 1865, when the war ended and freedom theoretically came to millions, those questions would become lethal, not for the system that had finally collapsed, but for the woman who had proven that the emperor had never worn any clothes at all. Sean Farrell arrived at Clemens Plantation on a Thursday morning in chains, and by Thursday evening he understood that everything he thought he knew about slavery in America had been built on the comfortable lie that skin color determined who held the whip. The woman who owned his contract stood on the manor house porch in a crisp white dress, watching as the overseer, a massive, free black man named Solomon Grant, removed Farrell's shackles with hands that moved with the casual efficiency of someone who had performed this ritual many times before. "Welcome to your new home, Mr. Farrell," Eliza said, her voice carrying across the yard with perfect clarity. "You will work 6 days a week, sunrise to sunset. You will be fed 3 meals daily. You will sleep in the quarters with the others. And if you run, I will use every legal means available to extend your contract by 5 years per attempt." She paused, letting the mathematics sink in. "Do we have an understanding?" Farrell opened his mouth to curse her, to spit, to do something that would restore his sense of dignity. But when he looked into her eyes, he saw something that stopped the words in his throat. The absolute certainty of someone who had won every legal battle she had ever fought and expected to win every one that followed. The plantation itself sprawled across 2,400 acres of rich bottomland along the Edisto River, its fields planted in tobacco that required constant, back-breaking attention from planting through harvest. The processing facility stood at the property's center, a massive barn where harvested leaves were hung, cured, pressed, and prepared for shipment to markets in Charleston and beyond. Workers' quarters lined the eastern edge of the property. 12 rough cabins that had once housed enslaved families, but now held a population that would have seemed impossible to anyone who believed America's racial mythology. 40 white men and women lived in those cabins by the summer of 1855. Irish immigrants whose passage debts had been purchased at auction. English convicts sentenced to labor terms and sold to private owners. Poor whites from the Carolina backcountry who had signed contracts binding themselves to years of work in exchange for forgiveness of debts they could never otherwise pay. They ranged in age from 16 to 53, their skills spanning everything from stone masonry to basic field labor, their contracts varying from 2 years to 15, depending on the circumstances that had brought them to Eliza's auction block. Solomon Grant managed them with an approach that combined strict discipline with calculated fairness. A former slave himself, freed 20 years earlier through purchase by a Quaker family in Pennsylvania, he had worked his way south again looking for opportunity and found it in Eliza's offer of employment at wages no white plantation would pay a black overseer. He understood the psychology of men who had never expected to take orders from someone of his race, and he calibrated his authority carefully, firm enough to maintain control, but never crossing into the sadism that characterized many white overseers' relationships with enslaved workers. The daily routine began at dawn when Grant rang the bell that summoned workers from their quarters. They assembled in the yard for inspection, bodies checked for signs of illness or injury, tools distributed, work assignments announced. Then they dispersed to their tasks. Some to the fields where tobacco plants required constant weeding and pest control, others to the processing facility where previous harvests needed attention, still others to maintenance work on buildings, fences, and the complex irrigation system that fed the plantation's productivity. Eliza herself supervised from a distance, maintaining the careful balance between involvement and delegation that her father had taught her. She walked the fields daily, observing work quality and noting which individuals showed aptitude for more skilled tasks. She reviewed Grant's reports each evening, tracking productivity and identifying problems before they escalated. And she maintained meticulous records of every aspect of plantation operations, not just for business purposes, but because she understood that her continued success depended on documentation that could withstand legal scrutiny if challenged. The workers' responses to their situation divided along predictable lines. Some, like Sean Farrell, seethed with resentment at the reversal of what they considered natural hierarchy. They worked because they had no choice, fulfilling the minimum requirements of their contracts while nurturing fantasies of escape or revenge. They gathered in the quarters at night, speaking in low voices about the injustice of taking orders from a mulatto and a Negro, reinforcing each other's sense of wounded pride. Others adapted with the pragmatism of people who had already survived worse. They recognized that Eliza's plantation offered conditions superior to most alternatives available to poor whites in the antebellum South. The food was adequate, the quarters weathertight, the work no harder than they would have faced as sharecroppers or factory laborers. Medical care was provided when needed, not out of compassion, but because Eliza understood that healthy workers produced more value than sick ones. Some even began to see their contracts as temporary inconveniences, finite periods to endure before regaining freedom, with skills and experience that might improve their prospects. A third group, smaller but significant, experienced something more complex. These were the children and teenagers who had been sold into servitude before they fully understood the racial hierarchies that supposedly governed American society. They had spent their formative years on Clemens Plantation learning that authority could wear any skin color, that competence mattered more than complexion, and that the entire edifice of white supremacy might be nothing more than a convenient fiction maintained by those who benefited from it. Sarah McBride was one such case. Sold at age 11 to settle her father's debts, she had spent 6 years working in the manor house, first in the kitchen, then as Eliza's personal assistant, as she demonstrated literacy and numerical aptitude. By 17, she managed household accounts and correspondence, her handwriting appearing on letters sent to Charleston merchants and tobacco buyers who never suspected they were negotiating with a white girl working under the supervision of a woman of color. Eliza recognized Sarah's value and treated her accordingly, not as an equal, because plantation hierarchy did not permit that regardless of race, but as a skilled employee whose labor deserved compensation beyond mere subsistence. When Sarah's contract expired in 1856, Eliza offered her continued employment at wages, a proposal that scandalized the other white workers, but which Sarah accepted without hesitation. She had no family to return to, no prospects beyond the plantation, and she had learned that competence purchased more security than whiteness ever guaranteed to the poor. The plantation's economic success was undeniable. Eliza's tobacco commanded premium prices in Charleston markets. Her processing facility operated with efficiency that rivaled any white-owned plantation, and her financial records showed profits that exceeded what her father had achieved with enslaved black labor. This success was noted, discussed, and deeply resented by neighboring white planters, who saw it as an implicit critique of their own operations and the racial ideology that justified them. But the greatest scandal was not economic. It was social. Eliza's plantation proved that the entire mythology of racial slavery, the claims that white people were naturally suited to command and black people naturally suited to servitude, was nothing more than self-serving fiction. If a woman of mixed race could profitably manage white workers using the same techniques white planters used to manage black slaves, then race had nothing to do with capability. The hierarchy was revealed as pure power, exercised by whoever controlled the legal and economic machinery that transformed human beings into commodities. This revelation was intolerable to South Carolina's planter class. They could accept free people of color existing in carefully controlled numbers. They could tolerate moderate success in trades and businesses that didn't challenge white dominance. But they could not allow Eliza's plantation to stand as proof that whiteness guaranteed nothing except the color of your skin. By 1860, pressure on Eliza was mounting. Anonymous letters arrived threatening violence. Newspapers published editorials questioning whether South Carolina's laws adequately restricted the property rights of free people of color. Local ministers preached sermons about the divine ordination of racial hierarchy and the dangers of allowing unnatural arrangements to persist. The state legislature debated new restrictions that would effectively prohibit people of color from purchasing white labor contracts, though the measures stalled due to concerns about interfering with property rights that white slaveholders also depended upon. Eliza responded to the pressure with the same calculated precision she applied to every aspect of plantation management. She ensured her legal documentation was impeccable. She cultivated relationships with Charleston merchants whose business interests depended on her continued operation, and she quietly prepared for the possibility that law and custom might not be enough to protect her from people determined to restore what they considered proper order. In the quarters, the white workers watched these developments with mixed emotions. Some hoped that external pressure would free them from contracts they resented. Others worried that disruption of the plantation would leave them with nowhere to go and no means of supporting themselves. And a few, like Sarah McBride, understood that whatever happened to Eliza would also determine their own fates in ways that had nothing to do with their wishes or choices. The storm that was building around Clemens Plantation in those final years before the Civil War was about more than one woman's legal right to own white labor. It was about whether America's racial mythology could survive contact with evidence that contradicted its foundational claims. And by 1865, when the war ended and freedom theoretically came to millions, the answer to that question would require Eliza's complete erasure from history, because the truth she represented was more dangerous than any battlefield defeat could ever be. The Union officer who arrived at Clemens Plantation on April 23, 1865, 11 days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox, carried orders to liberate enslaved people and restore order to a defeated South. But nothing in his military training prepared him for the sight of 40 white workers in the tobacco fields and a woman of mixed race standing on the manor house steps, with legal documents proving she owned them all. Captain James Hollister dismounted slowly, his hand instinctively moving toward his sidearm, not from threat, but from the profound disorientation of watching his understanding of American slavery collapse in real time. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I'm here to inform you that by proclamation of President Lincoln and the authority of the United States Army, all persons held in bondage in the rebellious states are hereby declared free." Eliza's expression didn't change. "Captain," she replied, her voice carrying the same precision she used when reviewing account books, "I don't own any enslaved people. I own labor contracts for indentured servants, all of them white, all of them legally purchased under South Carolina law. Would you like to see the documentation?" Hollister spent 3 hours that afternoon sitting in Eliza's study, examining contracts, bills of sale, and court records that proved beyond doubt that everything she claimed was accurate. The workers in her fields were not enslaved in the technical sense. They were bound by contracts that specified terms of service, conditions of labor, and dates of release. The Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment applied to chattel slavery, not to indentured servitude, which remained legal throughout the United States, including the northern states that had sent Hollister south. The captain was young, 26 years old, a Harvard graduate who had joined the Union Army in 1862, believing the war was about ending the moral evil of slavery. He had seen combat at Gettysburg, had witnessed the aftermath of Sherman's march, and had spent the final months of the war helping to process thousands of newly freed black people through military camps that struggled to provide food, shelter, and protection. His understanding of the conflict had been straightforward. Slavery was evil because it reduced human beings to property based on race, and ending it would restore the natural order where all men were created equal. But Clemens Plantation revealed something his Harvard professors had never mentioned: that the mechanisms of slavery, the contracts, the auctions, the legal frameworks that transformed human labor into tradable commodity, could operate independent of race. That whiteness was no protection against exploitation if you lacked money, legal standing, or powerful connections. And most disturbingly, that a person of color, with access to capital and legal expertise, could exercise the same power over white people that white slaveholders had exercised over black people for centuries. "What do you want me to do?" Hollister asked finally, staring at the neat rows of signatures and official seals that documented Eliza's transactions. "I want you to leave my property and allow me to continue operating my business," Eliza replied. "My workers' contracts range from 6 months to 8 years remaining. I've invested substantial capital in their purchase. I've committed no crime under any law, Confederate or Union. unless you're prepared to argue that the United States Army has the authority to void legally executed contracts without compensation, I suggest you return to your commanding officer and inform him that this plantation requires no intervention. Hollister did exactly that. His report to Colonel Marcus Webb in Charleston sparked 3 days of urgent correspondence with military authorities in Washington, who had no clear guidance for this situation. The legal minds advising the War Department had focused their attention on chattel slavery, the buying and selling of human beings as permanent property. Indentured servitude, while morally uncomfortable, remained legal practice even in northern states, where immigrants continued signing contracts binding their labor in exchange for passage, housing, or debt forgiveness. The military authorities finally decided that Eliza's contracts would stand. Interference would set a precedent that threatened indentured servitude systems throughout the country, systems that northern industrialists depended upon for cheap labor. The decision was made quietly, without public announcement, and Hollister received orders to move on to other plantations where actual enslaved black people needed military protection. But if the Union Army left Eliza alone, her white workers did not. The news that they remained bound to contracts while 4 million black people were being declared free triggered fury that had been building for years. The workers had endured their situation by telling themselves it was temporary, that once the war ended and order was restored, the natural hierarchy would reassert itself and they would return to being free white men whose status was guaranteed by skin color, if nothing else. Instead, they discovered that freedom had come to everyone except them. On the night of May 2, 1865, Sean Farrell called a meeting in the quarters. 23 of the 40 workers attended. Those whose resentment had never cooled, who had spent years nursing hatred of Eliza and Solomon Grant, who had convinced themselves that Confederate defeat would somehow liberate them from contracts signed long before the war began. "She's not protected anymore," Farrell said, his voice low and urgent. "The Confederacy's gone. South Carolina's under military occupation. All the laws she used to hide behind don't mean anything now. We take what should have been ours from the beginning, and we leave. By the time anyone notices, we'll be scattered across 3 states." Not everyone agreed. Some workers argued that breaking contracts would make them fugitives, that the Union Army might treat them as criminals rather than liberators. Others pointed out that they had nowhere to go, no resources to start over, that burning Eliza's plantation might feel satisfying, but would leave them worse off than before. But Farrell and his supporters had moved beyond practical considerations into the realm of wounded pride that demanded satisfaction, regardless of consequences. They had been forced to take orders from a woman of color and a black overseer. They had worked fields like common slaves while watching the Union Army free black people whose status they had always considered inferior to their own. And now, with the Confederacy defeated and the racial hierarchy supposedly being restored to its natural state, they remained bound by contracts that mocked everything they believed about whiteness guaranteeing dignity. The attack came on May 7th, just after midnight. 17 men, led by Farrell, set fire to the tobacco processing facility. The building was old, its timbers dry despite the coastal humidity, and flames spread with terrifying speed. Solomon Grant saw the glow from his cabin and ran toward the main house to alert Eliza. By the time they emerged, the processing facility was fully engulfed, flames reaching 30 feet into the night sky. The attackers had planned to burn the manor house next, but they hadn't accounted for the other workers, the ones who hadn't joined the meeting, who had made different calculations about their interests and loyalties. Sarah McBride had heard the plans from a friend and warned Eliza. By the time Farrell's group approached the manor, 10 workers, armed with tools and farm implements, stood between them and their target. The confrontation that followed lasted less than 5 minutes. No shots were fired because neither side had guns. But in the chaos of shouting and physical struggle, Sean Farrell found himself face to face with Solomon Grant, and decades of racial resentment compressed into a single moment of violence that left Farrell on the ground with a fractured skull, and Grant standing over him, breathing hard, a splitting maul still gripped in his hands. The sound of approaching horses scattered both groups. Captain Hollister had seen the fire from the road and arrived with 6 soldiers. What he found was a scene that defied simple categorization. A burning processing facility, 2 groups of white people in violent confrontation, a black overseer standing over a badly injured white man, and a woman of mixed race directing workers to form bucket brigades while maintaining absolute composure. Hollister arrested Farrell and 6 others, who were identified as primary instigators. The rest scattered into the night. Grant was also detained briefly, but Eliza's testimony and the statements of workers who had defended the property established that he had acted to prevent further arson and violence. The military report described the incident as labor unrest, resulting in property destruction and assault, language that carefully avoided mentioning the racial dynamics that made the confrontation politically explosive. Sean Farrell survived his injuries, but would carry permanent cognitive damage for the remaining 17 years of his life. He was convicted of arson and sentenced to 10 years of hard labor, not for attacking Eliza's property, but for destroying tobacco worth $8,000 that the Union Army had planned to confiscate as contraband of war. The other convicted participants received sentences ranging from 3 to 7 years. All were sent to prison facilities in the North, where they vanished into the anonymous population of white convicts whose stories rarely attracted attention or sympathy. Eliza rebuilt the processing facility using insurance payments and emergency loans from Charleston merchants who valued her business more than their discomfort with her race. But the attack had revealed what she already understood, that her position was untenable in the long term, that a South being rebuilt on white supremacy could not allow a woman of color to continue exercising power over white people, and that military protection was temporary while hatred was permanent. By September 1865, she had sold the plantation to a consortium of white investors for $47,000, approximately 60% of its actual value, but enough to establish financial security. The buyer's first act was releasing all remaining white workers from their contracts. Their second was hiring black laborers at wages barely above subsistence. Within 2 years, the plantation was producing less tobacco than it had under Eliza's management. But no one cared, because the racial hierarchy had been restored to its proper order. Eliza Clemens vanished from South Carolina records in October 1865. Some said she moved north to Philadelphia. Others claimed she went west to California, where racial lines were less rigidly drawn. A few insisted she had been quietly killed by former workers seeking revenge, her body buried in an unmarked grave that no one would acknowledge. What no one said publicly, what could not be said because it was too dangerous to the myths both North and South needed to believe, was that for 13 years, a woman of mixed race had proven that the entire edifice of American slavery had nothing to do with natural hierarchy and everything to do with power, exercised by whoever controlled the legal and economic machinery that transformed human beings into commodities. And that revelation was more threatening to America's self-image than any Confederate defeat could ever be. The last confirmed sighting of Eliza Clemens came from a Philadelphia boarding house ledger dated November 3, 1865, where she registered under the name E. Clements and paid for 3 nights in cash. But when a researcher named David Richardson found that ledger in 2019 while cataloging Reconstruction-era documents, he discovered something that should have been impossible. The same elegant handwriting appeared on a property deed filed in San Francisco in 1872, a business license in Chicago in 1881, and a philanthropic foundation charter in Boston in 1889, suggesting that either Eliza lived to at least 70 years old while maintaining perfect penmanship across 2 decades, or someone had inherited her signature, along with her determination to remain perpetually one step ahead of people trying to erase her from history. The trail didn't end in 1889. It multiplied, fractured, and spread across America like an underground river that occasionally surfaced in unexpected places, leaving evidence that some truths refuse to stay buried no matter how many people need them to disappear. David Richardson stumbled into Eliza's story accidentally. He was a graduate student researching economic patterns in post-war South Carolina, examining how plantations transitioned from slavery to wage labor. Clemens' plantation appeared in his data as an outlier. Exceptional productivity, unusually high property values, sudden sale at below market rates. In 1865, when he requested original records from Charleston's historical archives, a clerk mentioned that the plantation had an unusual ownership history, but offered no details. Richardson spent 3 months excavating fragments. A bill of sale here, a court filing there, newspaper mentions that used careful euphemisms to avoid stating what was actually happening. The pattern emerged slowly. A free woman of color, purchasing white indentured servants, operating a profitable tobacco plantation, and then vanishing completely when the war ended. But what transformed Richardson's curiosity into obsession was discovering that Eliza hadn't vanished at all. She had simply moved, changed her name slightly, and continued accumulating property and influence while staying carefully below the threshold of public attention that might invite scrutiny. The Philadelphia boarding house was the first link. E. Clements stayed 3 nights, then disappeared from the city's records. But 6 months later, a woman named Elizabeth Clemens purchased a small dry goods store in a predominantly black neighborhood. The store thrived, expanded, and by 1870 had become a supplier to larger retailers throughout Pennsylvania. Tax records showed the owner investing profits in real estate, boarding houses, small apartment buildings, properties that generated steady income from working-class tenants. In 1872, those Philadelphia properties were sold and the proceeds transferred to a San Francisco bank account belonging to Eliza C. Monroe. The account records showed investments in mining claims, railroad development bonds, and commercial real estate in the expanding city. By 1878, the investments had generated enough capital to purchase a small shipping company that moved goods between San Francisco and ports throughout the Pacific. Each move followed the same pattern: arrive in a new city, establish a business under a slightly altered name, operate profitably but quietly, invest proceeds in appreciating assets, then sell everything and relocate before becoming too visible or successful to avoid attention. Eliza was methodically building wealth while maintaining the invisibility that her survival required. Richardson traced her through Chicago, 1881-1885, where she operated a boarding house for black migrants fleeing Southern violence, through Denver, 1886-1888, where she invested in properties serving the city's growing population, and finally to Boston, 1889-1892, where the trail became more difficult to follow, because by then she would have been in her 60s, and Richardson couldn't determine whether the foundation charter he found was filed by Eliza herself or by someone working on her behalf. The Boston Foundation was called the Clemens Educational Trust. Its charter specified that funds would be used to provide scholarships for deserving students of color seeking higher education in northern institutions. The initial endowment was $50,000, a substantial sum that suggested decades of careful accumulation. The foundation's address corresponded to a building that no longer existed, demolished in 1920's urban renewal. The trustees listed on the charter were all deceased by 1910, and none had left papers mentioning how they came to be associated with the trust. But Richardson found something else. In the Foundation's archived correspondence from 1890, there was a letter from a Howard University student thanking Mrs. Clemens for a scholarship that allowed him to complete his studies. The letter described meeting Mrs. Clemens briefly in Boston, noting that she was a woman of advanced years but sharp mind, who spoke with great knowledge about the struggles our people face and the importance of education in securing our future. That would have made Eliza approximately 65 years old in 1890. Possible, certainly, but Richardson wondered whether the woman the student met was actually Eliza, or perhaps a daughter carrying on her work. The historical record offered no clarity. Free people of color in the 19th century often had fragmentary documentation, birth records missing, marriages unrecorded, children born without official acknowledgement. Eliza could have had a family, could have trained successors to continue her careful pattern of accumulation and reinvention, could have built a network that outlived her physical presence. What Richardson knew for certain was that someone had spent decades systematically erasing Eliza from official histories. The Charleston newspapers that had published scandalized articles about her plantation in the 1850s were missing pages when he examined archived copies. Court records that should have documented her property transactions had been removed from their chronological files. Even the bill of sale showing her purchase of Sean Farrell, the transaction that started Richardson's entire investigation, existed only as a fragment, torn from a ledger with most of the page destroyed. The erasure was too systematic to be accidental. Someone, or more likely multiple people across several decades, had worked to ensure that Eliza's story would not be easily recovered. The reasons were obvious. Her existence challenged too many necessary myths. To the north, she complicated the narrative that slavery was purely about racial oppression by showing that the mechanisms of bondage could operate independent of skin color. To the south, she proved that white supremacy was fiction rather than natural law. And to both sides, she represented the uncomfortable truth that America's economic system had always been about power and capital, with race serving as convenient justification rather than actual foundation. In 2021, Richardson published a carefully worded academic article about his findings. He described Eliza's plantation, documented her property transactions, and traced her movements through multiple cities. The article appeared in a specialized journal read primarily by historians and generated modest scholarly interest. Several academics praised his detective work. A few questioned whether the pattern he identified actually represented one woman or multiple people with similar names. Nobody challenged the basic facts because the evidence was too strong. But Richardson received one response that suggested Eliza's story had consequences extending beyond academic curiosity. An anonymous email, sent from an untraceable account, included a photograph. The image showed a group of well-dressed black professionals at a 1920s gathering. Doctors, lawyers, educators standing in front of a building with a banner reading, "Clemens Trust Annual Meeting." The email contained no text except a single line. Some legacies don't need names to survive. Richardson tried to respond, but the email address was invalid. He researched the photograph, identifying the building as the former headquarters of the Clemens Educational Trust in Boston. He found references to trust scholarship recipients who became prominent figures in early 20th century black professional communities, physicians who established clinics in underserved neighborhoods, attorneys who fought segregation cases, educators who founded schools when public systems refused to serve black students. The trust had operated continuously from 1889 until 1968, when its assets were transferred to a larger foundation with broader civil rights focus. During those 79 years, it had funded education for more than 2,000 students. Several of those students' descendants now held positions of influence in law, medicine, business, and academia. They were the inheritors of capital that Eliza had accumulated through methods that contemporary society found morally uncomfortable but legally unassailable. Richardson's final discovery came from a cemetery in Philadelphia. Following a tip from a genealogist, he located a gravestone marked simply E.C. 1825-1894. The plot was modest, its marker plain granite with no ornamentation. But the burial records showed that the plot had been purchased in 1865, 30 years before the marked death date, and that maintenance fees had been paid in advance through 1950. Someone had ensured Eliza would rest in marked ground, that her grave would be tended long after anyone who knew her personally was dead, and that at least one small piece of evidence would survive, proving she had existed, lived, and left something behind, beyond the discomfort her memory caused. Richardson stood in that Philadelphia cemetery on a cold afternoon in 2022, staring at those initials and dates, understanding that he would never know the complete story. The historical record was too fragmented, too deliberately damaged, the erasure too systematic. He would never find a photograph of Eliza's face, never read her private letters, never hear her voice beyond the careful legal language preserved in property documents. But he knew enough to understand what the anonymous email meant. Eliza's legacy wasn't her name in textbooks or monuments raised to her memory. It was the capital she accumulated, the trust she established, the students she funded, and the professional class they became. People whose achievements were built on foundations that Eliza constructed through methods both sides of the Civil War had needed to forget. She had proven that the system of American bondage was about power rather than race, that capital could purchase dignity regardless of skin color, and that the hierarchies everyone believed were natural were actually just convenient fictions enforced by whoever controlled the legal machinery. That proof was too dangerous to acknowledge, so both North and South had buried it. But buried things don't disappear. They wait in cemetery plots and foundation charters, in anonymous emails and scholarly articles, in the success of people who never knew a woman named Eliza Clemens, once purchased white men at auction, and used the profits to build a future where her descendants wouldn't have to. Some legacies don't need names to survive. They just need someone willing to remember that the official history isn't the only one that matters.